Welcome to Living the Reclaim Life podcast. I'm Denisha. We're glad you're here for conversations that revive hope, inspire healing, and encourage you to live a vibrant life with Christ. So grab a cup of coffee as we chat with today's guest. Well, welcome. Today, I have the privilege of having my friend Kelley here on the podcast. And I just want to tell you, friends, you are in for an amazing God story today. You know, we've talked about the different ways that God encounters our story, and you are about to hear how an evening with God saved her husband's life in a really traumatic incident. And so we're going to talk about that today. And Kelley and I have some major history together. Major. Mm-hmm. We have been friends for 17 years. In fact, our oldest is about to turn 18, and I'm freaking out because he was a baby, mm-hmm. right? And yeah, he was a tiny baby when I first met Kelley. And I have actually known Kelley's husband for longer than I've known Kelley. I've known him for 25 years, which is crazy. I would love to say we were in preschool together, but but we were not. And out of Mike meeting Kelley and calling me and saying, I have found the one, I got a best friend out of it. So it was pretty awesome.
Well, so did I. I got a husband and a best friend. So I double win for me.
There you go.
And now your youngest and my daughter are really close. I'd say besties.
Yep.
Definitely her guy bestie.
I know. It's such a fun dynamic watching two kids that are a boy and a girl like hang out and play. In fact, tonight there's a tent in our backyard and they're playing together and it's super fun. Kelley, you have so many amazing stories and so much wisdom. We're going to talk about a really hard time. And as we do that, let's let everybody get to know you a little bit more.
First of all, I want to say thank you for having me on your podcast. I'm honored to be a part of your amazing program and ministry, so thank you. I learned about an organization in the DC area when I was a senior in undergrad, and the bug bit me. I knew that I had to live there, and I didn't really care how I got there as far as, you know, waiting on tables or even cleaning toilets. I just fell in love with the city and ended up getting an internship with a nonprofit, which was kind of, you know, now looking back, a part of the start of it all. And I was lucky enough to get a job with a different nonprofit organization as an assistant to one of the vice presidents, and really did quite well there and received a number of promotions in a short period of time before then moving on to the organization that I worked for when I met my husband. And it was, and if it had not been for him, I'd probably still live there. I still love the city very much and try to go back on a regular basis. And I have taken my daughter there a number of times, and she now is a huge Washington Capitals fan. I am super proud of that. And sorry, Coyotes. We like you when you're not playing the Caps. But yeah, so I was there for just under a decade, and he swept me off my feet. He's in federal law enforcement and was traveling to Washington quite a bit at the time. The next step became moving out shortly after our wedding, and that's around the time that you and I met.
Yeah. And that I remember that being really hard for you too, because of your passion just for our nation and for the city.
It's definitely a place that has defined who I am in many ways, and that I can go back and visit anytime. And I still have good friends there, and I go back 2 or 3 times a year when possible.
She got me into the White House, a special tour, right, of the West Wing.
Right. And you can tell them what you did. You have to. It's like the best part.
Kelley gets me in to a private tour of the West Wing. And I am out of my mind excited that I am walking where presidents have walked and just world leaders. I'm incredibly in awe. Okay. And so they would not let us take our phones into this tour, right? So there's no pictures, no anything from inside the West Wing. For outside, we were allowed to. And I remember thinking, I just want to know I have something from the White House. at one part in the tour, we stopped and he said, if you guys need to use the restroom, it's right here. And so I went in first. And while I'm in there, I have this dumb moment where I'm thinking, okay, I can't have anything from the White House. So I'm going to take 2 squares of toilet paper. And you guys, it was not awesome. There was no presidential seal,
it was just toilet paper.
I take 2 squares feeling naughty. Okay. Like I'm doing something wrong, but I'm going to have proof that I was in the White House.
Meanwhile, she's in the bathroom and I'm out with my friend in the hallway and he leans over and says, it's the strangest thing. When people take tours of the White House, they often at this point will take some of the toilet paper from the bathroom because I don't know why people do that. It's the strangest thing, but it's like a regular thing. And so I'm like, yeah, that's kind of weird. Denisha comes out of the bathroom and it's my turn. So when I come out of the restroom, I had, as a joke, a couple squares of toilet paper in my hand. I go, look what I got. Shh, don't tell anybody. And my friend and I, he and I start just laughing because, the inside joke's on us. Little did either of us know at the time, though, that Denisha actually took 2 squares of toilet paper and had them hidden in her pocket.
And I am thinking, was the mirror a camera? Was the mirror recording me and told you guys that I stole toilet paper? I can feel my face flushing. Like I'm getting red. I got so nervous. And it wasn't until way later that night
that you confessed what you had done.
That I confessed to you. That I had
and then I told you the conversation that I had while you were in the bathroom and that was for whatever reason, a very regular thing. And so that you were very normal, very neurotypical of what people do when they visit.
That was a total side note. So you transitioned from this incredible career in DC where you worked your way up to just a fantastic position for your age. I mean, in your 20s, you just made this incredible ladder climb, essentially in a very pressure-filled city, right? Like there's a lot of intensity
for sure.
there.
There is quite a bit of intensity, and I took my career there quite seriously, and I landed in really good organizations and worked with some really great people, and whom I'm still in touch with right now even, and just lifelong friends that I cherish and appreciate so much, and who also helped to craft who I am. And so I take all of those memories and experiences with me. And, when I married Michael, I moved to Nevada where he was working out of, and was there for a number of years with him before we moved here to Tucson.
So you and Michael got married. And as you mentioned, he's a federal law enforcement. And
25 years now.
25 years. Oh, that's crazy.
This summer, yeah.
He was such a kid when I first met him.
He really was a kid. I think he was like 18 or 19 when you first met him.
Yeah, so crazy. I will never forget the call that I received. I was on vacation with my family, ironically in DC.
In DC, yeah.
Yeah, which is just totally not even a part of the story, right? Just a coincidence that we'd taken our kids to DC. And I got a call from you at 4 a.m.
I needed prayer, and you were the first person I thought to shoot up that lifeline to. And I guess that night, what ended up happening was it started off like any other night. He worked the evening shift, the shift through the night, and it's not uncommon for first responder spouses to not sleep great through the evening. So it's not uncommon for me to wake up in the middle of the night. And so this night didn't seem like any different in that regard. I woke up and checked on our dogs, checked on our daughter. And then I looked at my watch and saw that he should be home in about 15 minutes. So I called and said, hey, I'm awake. I'll wait up on you. And it went directly to voicemail, which is a little bit, shouldn't have happened. It's a little bit uncharacteristic. He would have, under normal circumstances, answered. So I called back, and again, it went directly to voicemail. And I thought, okay, that's odd. He should have been, like I said, 15 minutes from the house. So his phone should have been on the charger, but maybe he forgot his charger. Maybe he left his phone in his locker. Maybe, who knows? Maybe he was still out in the field and was detained because he was still working and couldn't come in. All of that has happened in the the 17 years that we've been together. And so I would have no reason to think that there was anything different with that night. I thought, well, maybe he is just still out in the field and still working and can't answer his phone, or he doesn't have great cell reception, because that's a thing. But I thought, what if tonight's that night? Like, it's the night that all first responder spouses know is a possibility. I mean, I didn't bank on it or live in fear of it, but it's always in the back of your head. It's always a possibility, and because it happens. And so I thought maybe if he's injured, but is by himself or still in the threat, then he needs help, and I don't know where he is, and I can't help him, but I am connected to the creator of this universe as a follower of Jesus, and I can pray for him. And so I did. I prayed for him, and I just started praying real general things I can't even remember in the beginning. Just like, if he's out there and he's needing support, if he needs help, please rush to his aid. And I noticed that I rolled into this intercessory prayer of, God, please light his path, over and over and over again. It's the phrase I couldn't get out of my head. That's what you pray when you want someone to come to know you. Lord, please light their path so that they can see their way to you. And you don't pray that for someone who has known you since he was a child. So I was a little confused by it, but I couldn't get the phrase out of my head, so I continued to just pray it. And eventually prayed myself back to sleep, but I rolled over onto the phone, and about an hour later, this would have been about 3:30 in the morning, he actually ended up calling me about an hour later. I wasn't immune to the fact that when his name popped up on my phone, that it might not have been him who was calling me. So again, there's that mental presence of being aware and prepared. But of course, I was excited that I had some sort of connection to him, but I didn't answer in time. And earlier, when I couldn't reach him, I had texted him and said, trying to reach you, going to voicemail, is everything okay? And so when I missed his call an hour later, he texted and said, I'm okay, got a boo-boo, going to the hospital. And so when I slid my phone open and called back, luckily he answered. And so I knew he was alive. I knew that the worst of his fate wasn't final. But I knew something was off because almost immediately he handed the phone to another a person with him. And so when she answered, I said, Are you in law enforcement? Are you EMS? Like, what are you doing? And she said, oh no, we actually know each other on Facebook. As soon as she reminded me who she was, I was like, oh yeah. So what's going on? And so she told me that he'd fallen down. He'd slid down the backside of a canyon, and he had injured himself, and she was driving him to where he could get some medical attention. And I thought, okay. And I was like having to pull information out of her. I remember asking if he was bleeding, and she said yes. But she kept saying, but he's going to live. And I was thinking, oh, good. I'm glad he'll live. Was there a reason why that might not be the case? And so I then asked her, I was like, well, are you driving him to the hospital? And she said, no, I'm driving him to an area where he can be helicoptered to it, where the helicopter could pick him up. And I thought, okay, there's trauma. Mm-hmm. Because you don't get in a helicopter unless there's trauma.
This is serious.
It's serious, yeah. So something had happened. That the night had happened. Then the night that we most dread, on some level, in some way, happened. And but he was alive. I knew he was alive. I'd heard his voice, and so I trusted that he was going to be okay. But I didn't know how badly he was injured. So there's always that thought in the back of your head, like he's on his way to the hospital. But what if something happens at the hospital? So. It wasn't completely at ease about the situation, but again, I had faith. And so then got off the phone with her and called you, but you were being good and sleeping in on vacation, as you should. So I left you a voicemail, and then ended up calling a series of other friends who ended up being real key in helping me figure out what was going on with him and what had happened. And so it was several hours later, because again, I was taking care of our daughter, and his agency was calling me and trying to brief me and explain to me some of what was going on. But I wasn't really free to talk because she was around. She's very inquisitive and smart. And so I kept saying, I can talk to you after 8:00. And I did. After 8:00, I called and said, what's going on? I'm on my way down to the hospital, and they were great. His agency has been very supportive of us, and I'm so grateful for that. I'm aware of how well we've been treated and taken care of, and the peer support team from his agency did an amazing job as well, taking care of us and providing for us in the aftermath of the incident. But when I finally arrived at the hospital, they ushered me in, and there are so many people in uniforms from all sorts of agencies in such a short period of time. I mean, word travels fast, I suppose, when something of that nature occurs. And was taken back into the ER bay that he was in, and I just remember him laying on this hospital bed with a white sheet over him up to his chest. And he had the collar around his neck still, and there was blood everywhere. And I remember thinking, oh my gosh, how serious is it? Well, it was actually from his finger. Fingers bleed a lot, I guess. And he had lost the finger in the incident. And as I would learn what happened, I would be told that he was shot 6 times. Basically, he was shot center in the vest. That would have been a fatal shot had he not been wearing his vest. And he was shot in the hip, but his radio caught that bullet. Thank God. And I know later he told me, he's like, I thought I was just being forgetful and I didn't charge my battery. And I thought, of all nights to forget to charge your battery is not the night that you get shot. Right?
Yeah.
But then later learned that there was actually, it had been damaged in the incident. He felt a little bit better about that. And then he had been shot in the hand and he lost a finger. And, and I even say, thank God he was shot twice in the knee, because that's what forced him to buckle and go down. And that 6th and final shot went over his head and landed behind his head, parallel to his neck, in the carrier seam of the backside of his protective vest. And, people are like, you're glad he got shot in the knee? Well, yeah, if he had not gotten shot in the knee, that final shot would have likely hit him in the head. And, I'd be sitting here having a conversation as a widow instead of as the wife of the survivor.
Yeah. And so you found out that not only had he been shot 6 times, but every move that he made during that attack was a move that saved his life, essentially. I mean, that's still just, I think I'll never get tired of hearing those pieces of the story. So he's on duty and he gets shot, right? Does he know where he was shot first?
Not exactly. I mean, he remembers
fast,
bits
probably.
and pieces. Oh yeah. I mean, gunfights are seconds long. I mean, they're over very quickly. And he'd actually blacked out because he was actually, we don't know for sure. He doesn't remember exactly, but he was the back of his helmet was damaged quite significantly. And that's another thing, is that was his helmet that he wore. He actually had and wore, and thank God, because it protected his head.
And they don't always wear helmets, right? Is that correct?
It depends on the
his
mission.
particular role, but not always.
Not always, but it just depends on what you're doing.
Right.
And he happened to be wearing one, and so it had been damaged pretty significantly. And he woke up. He had blacked out. So what he can remember was that he thinks that one of the first shots might have been to the chest, or maybe the hand, one of these upper level shots, because he remembers buckling. And so he didn't know that he'd been shot in the knee, but he remembers buckling. And that was, looking back, that's what forced him to go down. And even those shots were not only were they not fatal, but they were really clean shots. I mean, one of the shots to the knee was a graze, and the other one didn't there was some kinetic damage behind the patella, but the bullet skated over the top of the patella and came out about an inch and a half or so below the entry wound. And so it was miraculous. I expected when I lifted the sheet to see like hamburger meat on his leg, but his knee was intact, and the injuries, the bullet wounds, were very clear and obvious that even I could make them out.
Wow.
And so, yeah, so people are like, you're grateful that he was shot in the knee. I'm like, well, yeah, because that forced him to go down. If he had not gone down, even an inch farther than he did, that bullet would have gone through the top of his head. So it forced him to go completely down to the ground, and it missed him. It missed his hitting him and landing in the back of his vest.
And when you describe his vest, so me not knowing a ton, right, about law enforcement, but I know that it's a heavy vest, right? There's a thick seam because it's a thick material. And so he went down as his knee was hit, he goes down, and the bullet literally, would have had to have come within millimeters probably of his head in order to lodge into the seam that is at the back of his neck. That picture is just mind-blowing to me. Yeah, a miracle. An inch, a half an inch, a millimeter higher. We don't know what could have happened, but to the point he was at the perfect angle that bullet lodged into the back of his bulletproof vest.
Yeah, every shot was a miracle. The shot that he was wearing the vest that hit, in the center of his chest, that it hit the radio, that he only lost one finger, that his knee was shot, that the injuries weren't worse than they were, and that it forced him to go down to completely miss that final bullet going into his head.
6 shots. That is, you're right. Every one of those is a miracle.
Absolutely.
Wow. So what happened next? So he encounters this. He falls. Is that correct? He fell, as they told you.
He did fall down. Well, he did fall down the backside of a canyon.
But he didn't exactly get a boo-boo.
It was a little bit more than a boo-boo.
A little bit.
But that's his personality, too. You know.
I got a boo-boo. I'm headed to the hospital.
He didn't want me to worry. That our guys don't want us to worry.
Yeah. So he blacks out. He comes to, and then what happened next?
So he told me in the ER that when he woke up and he came to, that he could see he was on his back, or he rolled over on his back, and then he saw the sky from peripheral to peripheral, and it was just like the whole galaxy was his theater. It was just like right there in front of him. What's the Hillsong United? Is it Hillsong United or Hillsong? The song that I will praise you. If 10,000 stars can praise you, so will I. Is it 10,000 or 10 million? Probably 10 million.
Yeah, so will I. Yeah,
so will I. That song. I think when he tells that part of the story, I always think of the Hillsong song, "So Will I," because if the skies can praise him, so will I.
And here he's laying on his back.
He's
in the
laying
middle of the desert, shot 6 times, and staring at the galaxy.
And he didn't feel anything at the time. And he told me that he first wondered, "Am I in heaven? Is this what heaven is like? Or journeying to heaven? Am I on my way to heaven?" He felt no pain, and it was deafeningly quiet, and all he could see was this magnificent galaxy in front of him. And then the pain started coursing through his body, and he thought, "Well, nope, can't be dead. I wouldn't feel this in heaven." And so as a medic for his agency, he started raking his body for injuries. He just went into go mode. That's just instinctive for medics to perform in that way, and started treating himself, started treating his wounds. He wrapped his hand. He felt his knee was sticky, and he knew that was an indication of blood and being injured. So he created a tourniquet. Well, he put a tourniquet on and created a splint in order to help him walk. He didn't know how bad his injuries were, but he wasn't going to take any chances because it was super dark out there, and he didn't want to flash his flashlight. He didn't want to flash his flashlight to give his position away, so he kept his lights off and started to make his way back to his truck. He did try to radio out, and he couldn't get out. That's when he thought he didn't charge his battery, and thought, of all nights, not to charge your battery. But it had been shot, so he couldn't radio out. He was not within cell reception. And he thought, if I'm going to survive, I'm going to have to make it back by myself. And so he started making his way, but he was in shock and he was disoriented, and it was very dark because he didn't want to give away his sign, like I said. So he knew he was wandering out there in the field too long. And he was probably like running circles. I mean, he wasn't getting back to his truck like he should have been. And he knew it, and he started to get frustrated because as a medic, he knows that his body can go, the shock that his body's in, his brain can tell his body to start shutting down organs. And it was like he was fighting with himself with that knowledge that was saving his life, but he also knew how his life was in jeopardy, potentially. And at one point, he was very frustrated and started to think about giving up and just sitting down and letting it be what it was. And then at that point, he saw and heard our daughter say, "Man up, Dad, man up." So he stood back up, and he started in a direction that he didn't know if it was the direction that he should be heading, and started walking. And on his helmet, he had night vision goggles, and they had been damaged in the incident. And so he had flipped them up and was truly walking blind in the dark because those weren't working.
And how far away from his truck was he? Like about?
I don't know, a quarter of a mile, maybe, like a 20, 25-minute walk at this point. And was really very close, but didn't know it. And he heard the night vision goggles power up. And so he flipped them down real quick. And for just what felt like a moment, they flickered on. And that is when he saw the IR light. It's a red light. You can't see it to the naked eye. You can only see it with like IR, night vision goggles. That IR light in the grill of his truck that he had happened to flip on before he had gone out into the field that night was lit, shining up and lighting his path. And when he told me that in the ER, immediately, just from head to toe, I felt chills and immediately started crying. If you think you weren't crying before, but I was like really being tough. But when he told me that, I lost it because I knew in that moment that God had allowed me to play a part in his survival. Because when I was praying earlier that night, if he's alive and he needs help, I might be the only person that is aware of it on some level. I mean, I wasn't sure. But if he was in trouble, I was connected to the creator of the universe that could intercede and help him. And he did. He lit his path when I asked him to. That's what I kept praying over and over again. I didn't know why am I praying this? And
when you're questioning, like, God, that's a prayer you pray when you're wanting someone to come to you.
Right.
Light
a general
their path
prayer.
To you.
It was like a very general prayer, I thought. Yeah. But I was in that moment praying the most specific prayer that he could have needed in that moment. And I thought, if ever I've questioned the power of prayer in the past, if ever I've questioned God's being for me, God being for me or being for my family, or even being real for that matter.
Right.
I didn't question it ever again. And I haven't questioned it ever again. And when I told Michael in the hospital, because he wanted to know why I was reacting so viscerally, I shared with him what I've just shared with you about waking up in the middle of the night and praying. And so there we are in the ER, him with the neck collar on and his finger bleeding everywhere. We're just crying together in that moment, really acknowledging God's presence and his being for us and him protecting Michael out there and navigating his way in such a way that he, even though it was very dire and serious and dangerous, he was covered the whole time. He was protected by God's sovereignty. And we knew it in that moment. And there in the ER bay and just cried and praised God together in that moment.
Oh, God's so amazing that he was with you, right? Leading you to pray that prayer, light his path. he was with Michael at the exact same time. And his omnipresence of just being able to be everywhere at the same time was so evident in your story.
Absolutely. And like I said, if I had ever questioned that in the past, I haven't since. And it was such a profound reality to me of his goodness and his favor over us. I mean, and I'm not saying that life has been super easy in the last 2.5 years. In fact, there have been harder moments than that night that he was shot since that night. But even all through it, I had that night, I had that prayer to hold on to, and know that, no, he's with us. He was there that night. He's here right now. He's here even when I'm just feeling sort of blah. There's nothing necessarily going on that would make me feel that, but that's what trauma does. I mean, it's a beast that takes what it wants when it wants, with no regard for how you feel about it. You might have a little bit of a choice in how you react, but even sometimes I've noticed that, I just have to go into a place where I surrender the situation to God, because it seems so overwhelming and insurmountable that there's not a way through. But again, I remember there's a way through. There's a path that you lit for us, and that you're continuing to light for us and guide us through the darkness.
It speaks so much to the power of prayer, just in when we get that nudge on our heart. And even thank you for being so just vulnerable and sharing where your mind went that night.
Absolutely.
Either he's not answering his phone because he's, maybe he's just working late. Maybe he left his phone in his locker, or maybe it's the worst case scenario. And you followed that path and you chose to pray. And I think there's so many times, when we feel a nudge to pray, or we begin to get in that fear of where we start walking out the worst case scenario. And of course you're trained in that, right? So it's a very natural response.
In order to be able to live under the same roof with my husband, I've had to become a little bit, intense like he is.
Yeah, I think that's par for the core when in that field. And so, yeah, it really speaks to the power of prayer, and just how much when we feel that nudge, when we feel out of control, when you couldn't be there with him, but knowing that God was, it just really speaks to that. It encourages me when I let my prayer guard down, if you will, to know that prayer does make a difference. I think it's impossible to pray without something somewhere changing. And I think that's super encouraging for us.
It's certainly encouraging for me. I know that my prayer life has become more faithful and trusting in the words that I'm speaking, that they're actually being met by a creator who loves us and is hearing me and is working for his good, but is working for what's good for me too. And I think, like all of us, and myself included, we think we know what good is. But I'm learning through this incident and through these seasons that we've been walking through for the last couple of years, that it doesn't always feel good, but his goodness is still evident in our lives. And it's really just impacted my prayer life in a way that I feel like it's more meaningful and more potent.
After everything, you sort of hit you. You were strong in the moment. You had to be his advocate, right? I think so many people can relate to being an advocate for someone, whether it be a child, whether it be a spouse or an aging parent. I think there's so many different times that we have to advocate, but you learned something very powerful through advocating for him, walking your daughter through having to let her know that her dad had been shot and that he was missing a finger, the things that little girls, are going to pay attention to. The whole picture's too big, but you had to walk her through what had happened. As you took care of him and as you took care of your daughter, how did that affect you? What effect did that have on you personally as the caretaker?
Well, I immediately went into go mode once I had been briefed by his agency. They did a great job being transparent with what they knew and what we were facing, and just in the aftermath of an incident of that nature. And so I went into go mode. I just went into getting things done and making sure that doctor's appointments were made. And I remember making an appointment with a therapist a week after the shooting. And I told my husband, I said, "You're going. And if you don't go, you're going to have bigger problems than having been shot 6 times." Luckily he went. And, but it was
smart man.
It was that moment of him realizing that it's okay to not be okay. That's a term, that's a phrase that has become a little bit of a catchphrase, but it's true. It's okay to not be okay. And in that moment, we were so grateful that he survived, and he survived so well, short of not happening. I don't think it could have really happened any better. I mean, we said earlier, like every shot was a miracle. And we acknowledged that we kind of landed really on a high note of gratitude. But I knew that wasn't realistic to stay there forever. Talking to doctors and his agency and making statements and talking to attorneys and, just covering all of our bases and taking care of our daughter and taking care of him, that I emotionally was stable and I was okay. But my body was breaking down. Within a month of the incident, I had developed an ulcer and wasn't able to get into the doctor for about 6 months later. That's how long the wait was. And at one point, right before I had the appointment, I was really scared that I was really sick, and I wasn't associating it with it potentially being an ulcer. And I felt so relieved once I knew what it was and that it could be pointed back to the incident. But, I broke down when I started to see signs of our daughter breaking down a little bit, because it crushes a mama's heart when you see your child suffer. And so Michael and I took action to get some therapy to learn how to parent her through it. And she did remarkably well, and she's still doing remarkably well. And I learned in those moments that I needed, as the caregiver, normally caregivers don't realize that they're behind the 8 ball, or that they're physically breaking down or emotionally breaking down until they're already in the process of it happening. And so I didn't want to have that happen, because I needed to be able to remain strong and get things done and support my family. So I made sure that I got as much sleep as I could. I mean, these are very simple things, but it's sort of like tactically mindfulness.
Taking care of yourself.
Taking care of yourself. And, I would drink a lot of water and try to get some good sleep. And I would eat, even if I wasn't hungry, but it was time to eat. Very basic things. But I also learned, how to breathe properly. And one of the things that I found for me in grounding myself when I'm feeling anxious is when I'm feeling that feeling, is recognizing it and not stuffing it down. Is I write, I journal, and it's like power journaling. It's like doing it in 10-minute increments, and I set a timer, and I don't even think about what I'm writing, and I just type. And whatever comes out is what comes out. And it's been really helpful for me. I'm not really a journaler otherwise. I don't like sit down and journal, but I have power journaled really well over the last couple of years. And I'm kind of surprised with some of the stuff that comes out, because I'm not even always aware of what I'm feeling until I start writing. And then when the buzzer goes off, I'll go back and I'll read it. And I'm not reading it for accuracy or even grammar. I mean, sometimes it's not grammatically correct at all. My author friends would tisk me, but
cringe.
I can always go back and edit it. But it's personal. It's for me, right? It's actually a grounding technique that I've learned to use for myself. So I don't necessarily plan to do anything with it. But that's been really helpful. And that's been tangible. That's something tangible that I've learned to do for myself.
Yeah. And one of our friends, I remember, asked you in the midst of it, how are you? And you said, I'm fascinated. This is so interesting.
Yeah. I mean, I was still feeling all of the feels, right? I was still going through all of the emotions, and there was, anxiety that I was definitely aware of, but there was something very fascinating about the process of what we were walking through. And I noticed it. I recognized it. And it still fascinates me.
And that fascination led you to go back to school to get your master's degree. I'm so just proud of you for doing that.
Oh, thank you. I'm excited and I'm loving what I'm learning. So I'm going to become a clinical therapist in probably about a year. I'm about halfway through, and not quite, but almost. And it's something that I've been thinking about and praying over and considering for about 7 years. I remember our daughter was a baby at the time when I started getting this thought, but it didn't really make sense what to do with it until the last couple of years. And it was actually our trauma therapist that challenged me to really explore what that would look like. And out of some of those conversations led me to researching schools and applying and getting in. And I'm really enjoying the process.
I'm so glad you did, because I think there's a lot of people who you're going to be able to help, because you're not speaking of trauma and advocacy and all of the things in counseling. You're not speaking of that as someone who's removed from having gone through it. You're speaking of it out of knowing what it feels like to sit in the chair of the people that you're helping. So I think you're going to be incredible at that. I'm really excited to see what God has for you in the future with it.
Oh, thank you. I am too.
And you and I happen to love a particular pastor, and Craig Rochelle.
Yes.
He has a quote that you came across that speaks so powerfully to what you experienced. Do you want to read it?
Yes. And this was just today, as a matter of fact. And I thought this was so poignant, and it sort of outlined perfectly the journey that my family's been on for the last couple of years, and certainly applied to the conversation that I knew that we were going to have. It takes pain to have progress. It takes a hurt to have healing. It takes a struggle to have a story worth telling. And it takes a trial to have a testimony. And those were really profound statements for me, because this is not a journey that I chose, that my husband chose, that even our daughter chose, but this is the journey that God always knew that we were going to be on. And He allowed it, and He's provided and protected us through it. And one of the takeaways that I've learned, I've had to learn it, is to hold things loosely, to hold things that I care most about with open hands. Mm-hmm. Hold my husband with open hands, hold my daughter with open hands. And that's really hard, especially when we're talking about kids. But when I can do that, when I learn to do that and hold things loosely, I'm really surrendering and asking God to take care of it, and asking Him to, you talked about me being my husband's advocate, but really God is our advocate. Yeah. God is the one that if we let Him play a role in our survival, then He can do some pretty amazing things if we hold the things that are important to us loosely.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's just a great picture of having open hands and trusting that He was with us, is with us, and will be with us. And we can trust in that. That's beautiful. Kel, thank you so much for sharing and for just letting us have a peek into that night that was probably one of the hardest nights, but also so many times you can see God's footprints amongst that trial. So I just think you guys have an amazing testimony out of that, just as that quote said. So thank you for sharing.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me.
Anytime, girl. Thanks for listening. I pray you found hope in today's conversation and maybe even feel a little less alone in your story. Stay connected with us on Facebook and Instagram at Reclaimed Story. Want to learn more about living a reclaimed life and how you can be a part of our growing community of reclaimers? Check out our website at reclaimedstory.com. All of those links and more will be in the show notes. And if you enjoyed this inspirational podcast, be sure to subscribe, rate, and review. That is a huge help in helping us reach more people to live the reclaimed life. Thank you so much for listening.